Welcome to Asian Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. My guest today is Ray Tsuchiyama. Ray lived in Japan for over 20 years. We had some very, very responsible positions. One was head of the Asia office for MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He also had executive positions with AOL and also Analog Devices. He has a wealth of knowledge, not only about Japan, but other parts of Asia, and in those positions he held his responsibilities covered certain operations in other Asian countries. Today we'd like to focus on Taiwan, which Ray is very familiar with, and take a look at Taiwan's economy. Typically on Asian Review we look at security affairs, we look at strategic affairs, domestic politics, and that kind of thing, especially with the all-important upcoming 2016 election for president and legislature in Taiwan. Today, we're going to go at this a little bit differently and take a look at the economy. Welcome to Asian Review.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. Well, what's become of Taiwan? I mean, is it really still an economic tiger?
It's in a very, I guess, a moment in time that it's searching for the future. As early as the early 60s, it was on par with the Congo. So it's really advanced since then. However, within the last few years, it had a major recession in 2008. Thousands of people, unfortunately, were let go, and companies went bankrupt. And the new president had a goal, and much repeated in the media, 633, which means 6% annual growth, 3% unemployment, and $30,000 US dollars a year annual income.
All of which he has not achieved.
That's correct. And it's barely 2% annual growth, barely. Japan is, of course, flat, back again in recession. Unemployment grew to 4% and more in Taiwan, and it's been tough. It's a country in flux, I think, still looking very much at the huge China market across the strait, and globally, and yet unable to really be a key scene or venue or a key player in the high-tech world in branding.
Interesting. Let's get back to that point about branding, but let me ask you this. Has too much money been taken out of Taiwan and invested in the mainland to the point where it's really hurt Taiwan's domestic economy, hollowed it out?
It was, I think, irresistible for many, many companies, CEOs in Taiwan.
That's a really good way to put it.
Because across the strait, all of a sudden, until very few years ago, you couldn't even go directly to China. You had to go to third Hong Kong and then get on another plane. And ships had to unload in another port, put in another ship, and go to. So all that China and Taiwan transportation logistics and so forth was a pain in economic growth. But they looked at the China market and growth of 1.5 billion consumers, and of course not only the consumers but a workforce, and they could communicate in Chinese. So. And many of the companies like Foxconn would be a good example of that, employing literally hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people on the mainland, and they are subcontractors.
Let me just jump in here a second. For the benefit of our viewing audience, Foxconn is a huge contract producer. It makes products for, what all do they make? They make iPads, they make all types of Apple products, and they make products for other companies, I suppose for Hewlett-Packard.
Well, many high-tech firms contract out to Foxconn, U.S., European, Japanese, and of course even Taiwanese.
Even Taiwanese. Okay.
But you're going to an interesting point. What happened to all those factories back in Taiwan? And you're correct that there was a hollowing out of Taiwan, and they became, a rural, poorer economy in parts of Taiwan. And at the same time, we don't have very clear statistics. It may be 10% of the entire population went to live in China.
Right.
There's a whole section in Shanghai that I've been to. That's a street full of Taiwanese restaurants, bars, nightclubs, and so forth. And they all have Taiwanese food, which the Taiwanese feel is much healthier and less oily than the mainland food.
That's a good one.
And so they all speak Taiwanese, have a great time. But again, they took their expertise and then began running large manufacturing plants around Shanghai, in Guangdong in the south and around there. And began to export not only to the U.S. and the globe, but also to satisfy the local market. And was that a hollowing out? I would say in the short term, yes. And in fact, in the longer term, they were, I guess, seduced by the huge market that they couldn't really go to invent or innovate new products for the global scene.
Well, are they going to be able to break out of that? Are they going to be able to get off of this addiction to cheap labor and contract manufacturing?
I think it will take a sea change in how the companies within Taiwan want to position themselves for the future. There's been some companies in Japan that got foreign nationals as part of their management teams, for example. Samsung, LG globalized in many ways. But Taiwanese are more or less family-run businesses when you think about it. They grew very large.
Right.
And they trust each other and their relatives and so forth. It's unlike the chaebol, South Korean or Japanese ways of business. It's based on exams and merit and hierarchy. They're much more, smaller, and they have succession problems. They have, difficulties in who becomes the next CEO, kind of thing.
Well, that's making some really good points there. The chaebol system, which is basically a reflection of Japanese economic model.
The Keidetsu,
Focuses on big companies, big manufacturing concerns, interlocking ownership, that sort of thing, groups. Taiwan never went that way.
That's right. And if you can look at the top firms in Japan, Hitachi, for example, has been a major player for a century or more. Toyota been there for a long time. Matsushita, of course. But there have been some companies that grew very large. Kyocera, Matsushita, Fujitsu, and NEC are post-war phenomena,
right.
And so forth, but very large. And in South Korea, you're correct. The Hyundai, Samsung, Lucky Ghost, or LGs are very large companies, but stock companies. In Taiwan, it's interesting to see the one company that I visited in 1984, Tatung, been around since, I don't know, the early 20th century, but still is at $1 billion. Gross revenues. It never really became very large. It never became a global player. Now, there are very large conglomerates like Formosa Plastics and so forth. But I'll give you an interesting example, HTC.
Okay.
HTC is a high-tech corporation.
They make cell phones.
Yes, they make cell phones, and they've been around since about the late 90s. When I visited them around 2000, 2001, I met Peter Zhou, who later became the president, and several of his vice presidents. I said, where are you from? Where did you work before? And they all said they worked in the R&D plant for Digital Equipment Corporation, a U.S. company. And where I used to work in Massachusetts. So we had a really good topic to talk together. Now, HTC became what exactly you said, an ODM, a contractor. Their first Windows phone was for Orange, a operator, wireless mobile operator in Europe. And others followed, Android and more Windows Phone and so forth. But again, when they went and made their own HTC brand phone, never took off. Apple came, to the scene. The other phones with the Android software, and so they couldn't develop their own OS, the operating system for a phone. They were reliant on others, Apples and the Androids and Windows and so forth, and they were just stuck in making the hardware.
You know, one thing that I've heard, and I'm wondering if you've heard this as well. Okay, we're talking about how Japan, development came with the big corporations, okay, and that was a model, was essentially copied in South Korea. Taiwan never went that way, and one thing that I've heard is that Chiang Kai-shek was very opposed to the creation of big corporations because he thought that they could be a source of political power used against him. So, due to his influence, corporations in Taiwan were fairly small scale, small and medium-sized companies. Now, as you said, some big companies already popped up, like Formosa Plastics, and some of, China Shipbuilding, China Steel, but they're all state-owned companies. Some people say, well, that was an advantage for Taiwan. With the small companies, they could adapt very fast. But I don't hear that being pointed out as an advantage these days.
Well, I think if you compare to Germany has many medium-sized companies that export precision equipment and so forth, and play a role in the high niche markets of electronics and medical and instrumentation and so forth. Taiwan's could have, I think, gone that route of innovation and reaching for the top niche of the market. But there were issues, I think, in number one, the education system, the research universities really were not highly developed. Many people left for the U.S.
Right.
And before they left for Japan to study, and many of them didn't come back. You find many Taiwanese who are at IBMs and the AT&Ts and other major corporations. The other area, I think, just like what you said, the family-run businesses have difficulties in management, global management. You can do management of a medium-sized company very well, or you can go to the mainland and look over many factories. But to do global management of incorporating foreigners into your board of directors, incorporating a lot of more research R&D plants, outside in the U.S. and in Europe and Japan and so forth, never really got going. And the third is, of course, like Japan and South Korea in some ways, the lack of venture capital and that culture of dynamic entrepreneurship is not there.
You mentioned a couple really interesting things here, which I think we should dig into a little bit more deeply. One is, and what I think you're sort of suggesting there, although you didn't quite say it directly, is in East Asia, the culture sort of mitigates against creativity, which is the essence of these higher value-added products that every country in Asia really wants its economy to be based on now, at least Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, okay? That's something I think we should dig into a little more deeply. The other thing he said is about the role of venture capitalism, because traditionally Asian countries don't go for this. Like the U.S. is all about venture capitalism. It's risky stuff, but it has the possibility of yielding big payouts. But this is just not part of the Asian mindset.
Well, yeah, when you look at the U.S., and I like to quote Peter Drucker, and he said, Europe and Japan are the norm in terms of societies. The U.S. is the great exception. and
That's well put.
Well, when you look at Japan and Europe, and including Europe and South Korea, many hierarchical Confucian-based societies in East Asia, they're more or less alike. They have the leaders coming from the same colleges. It's hierarchical. They don't have immigrants, unlike the U.S. And in Silicon Valley, at least 1 out of 3 new startups was launched by an Indian or Chinese immigrant.
Let's put that on pause for a second because we need to take a break here. You're watching Asia in Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp, having a really interesting conversation here today with Ray Tsuchiyama, who is a person with lots and lots of experience in Asia. And our show today is Taiwan, still an economic tiger. And we're talking about the reasons that Taiwan's economy seems to have slipped. And hopefully in the source of our discussion, we'll find a way or be able to suggest a way that it might get back on track. So don't go away because we'll be right back.
Aloha, my name is Miley Scarpino and I'm the host of the Empower Hour. If you're interested in health, nutrition, fitness, here on the island of Oahu, want to learn more about places to train at or different trainers available, then watch my show on Fridays at 3. We have a great time and I hope that you'll come join us. Much aloha, now go get swole!
Hi, I'm Jay Fidel. That's Ted Ralston. You know, Ted is the host of Where the Road Leads. It shows every Friday from 4 to 5 p.m. It's about technology. It's about how people collaborating and solve problems with modern technology. It's where the road leads. We all know that. We should all be listening. Join us there, 4 to 5 p.m. every Friday. Now, what about that do you agree with?
All of it.
I knew he'd say that. Aloha. Say aloha.
Aloha.
Good.
This is Alice Lee Hagan, host of ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. My show here at ThinkTech Hawaii is every Thursday from 3 to 4 in the afternoon. I bring in interesting guests from Hawaii, the mainland, and hopefully international guests in the future. Do join us on Thursday from 3 to 4 p.m. ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. Aloha.
Welcome back to Asia in Review. We're having a really good conversation here with Ray Tsuchiyama. We're talking about why Taiwan's economy has relatively slowed up, why it's not quite the tiger it used to be. When we went into break, we were talking about cultural adaptations, shall we call it, and also the role of venture capitalism, or lack of a role of venture capitalism, not only in Taiwan, but other Asian countries. But before we get back into that, I'd like to bring a picture up on the screen here. And Ray, there's a pretty important person there, a couple of important people, including yourself. Maybe you could tell us who some of these folks are, especially that person right in the middle. I think he's a really interesting gentleman.
Well, Mr. Lin is the CEO at that time of Datung, a company at the forefront of electronics. Was a visit to the Hsinchu Science Park. It had just opened, and Datung had a major presence there. To the left of the CEO is Clint Churchill of Campbell Estate, and then Homer Maxey, Foreign Trade Zone manager of that time. And I forgot the name of the person to the extreme left, but he was an advisor to the Hawaii state government. I'm on his right, and then there's Ken Kwok, who was the head of the international division of Department of Business and Economic Development of that time, DBED of that time.
Datung is sort of like, would it be fair to say, the General Electric of Taiwan?
Oh, yeah, of that time, yes.
At that time.
Yeah,
That's a
time.
company that's somewhat slipped.
Yes, and
in
again, they do contract work for many, many companies, like even for pads and iPads, tablet PCs and laptops and so forth. And again, many of the laptops in the world, like Toshiba or Panasonic or NECs and Fujitsu's, were all made in Taiwan by the Quantas, the Arimas, the Winstroms, and Acers and so forth, that people don't know their names, actually. Again, going back to branding. Mm-hmm. And we talked about venture capital and about high tech, and one of the things about global success is about branding. Because when you look at back then, an iPod, which is a white, a little minimalist, kind of pad with a $1.50 memory hardware, and marketing is 95% of that little device, and it's a global success.
Right. Well, Yeah, we want to get back to the cultural thing of intro to capitalism, but since you mentioned branding, and I think we did say we're going to go back there, isn't one of Taiwan's problems, it doesn't really have a famous brand?
You're correct. And in fact, the last big effort was BenQ buying the Siemens handset division way back in the early 2000s, and wanted to capture, kind of leverage that into a global brand. And BenQ never really rose out of that, trying to capitalize on the Siemens handset brand. It's ironic to point out that the one company that in East Asia that has done a little better in that, Lenovo, which is a mainland Chinese company,
Which is a mainland
bought
Chinese
the
company.
The IBM PC business,
Right.
the ThinkPads and so forth,
Right.
and really leveraged that, I think, and went out there, and you see that Lenovo much better in the global branding scene, along with Haier, which is in white goods.
Right.
But aside from that, in Taiwan, again, it was easier to do the contracting for the big names like the Sonys and Panasonics and Fujitsu's NECs.
You know, like, okay, I'll put a plug in for Acer, especially since I have an Acer notebook. but I think, you know, objectively speaking, I think Lenovo is better known than Acer. Taiwan Semiconductors, okay, that's a big company, highly successful, but semiconductors are like put into computers. You know, they don't have the benefit of looking at a computer and then it has across the brand name. So there's probably a lot of people, unless they're really into the high-tech world or into investing, that might not know about Taiwan Semiconductor.
You're exactly right. Morris Chang, one of the founders of Taiwan Semiconductor, really developed that electronic side of the business really
Right.
well. And so what happens is that when a company has an idea for a new chip, they can go across the street and to get it designed and make a prototype. It's so easy to do that in Taiwan. But many of those people also came out of the military. As you know, there's still a draft in Taiwan.
Right.
And there is a lot of people who went trained at military schools and learn electronics and dealing with the defense systems. So that's a connection there. But again, the smaller companies becoming bigger and so forth just isn't there.
Yeah.
It's the middle companies. So there's
Right.
a lot of medium-sized companies.
Right. Culture. We were talking a little bit about that before, just before the break. It seems that, it's Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, I think China is obviously part of that. Due to the Confucian influence and the strictness of these societies, because all these societies are very strict, is like making a mistake is a huge problem. A loss of face, your boss comes down on you because you made a mistake. This is not really a very conducive cultural attribute to have if you're trying to devise a society that's based on creation, because creation requires making mistakes before you come out with the end product. And it seems that all these societies are having a huge problem in overcoming this. And I've seen projects in Taiwan that seek to foster creativity, to develop new mindsets. But it's changing thousands of years of history. And the examination system that's such a big part of people's lives in all these countries, it's essentially based on rote memorization. And it really doesn't call for a lot of creativity or thinking out of the box. In Asian societies, you're expected to follow a norm, and the norm is pretty tightly controlled. And people that step out of the norm, they run into trouble. I've talked to, in fact, I knew a friend of mine, Japanese, who received a PhD at MIT, actually, in let me see, ceramics engineering, I believe it was. He went back, he got a job at Keio University. He couldn't handle the confines of the system. He was very junior. The senior professors, some whose research might have been out of date, really came down on him hard. He ended up teaching at Cal Berkeley. How do you change that? How do you change that mindset? I mean, this is a very long-term process.
It is a long-term process, and you know, Taiwan, I think, had an easier time really industrialization, going through industrialization in the 60s and 70s because it had a Japanese school system in many ways. And compulsory education was instituted as part of the Japanese Empire at that point. And even the former president, President Lee, went through a imperial high school in Taiwan. So it has, what I'm saying is there's the vestiges of the Japanese school system in Taiwan. I think you're correct that the exam held system is consistent, consistent in that region.
Well
it's
put.
not just Japan. It's not just South Korea. You know, it's also mainland China and trying to get into Tsinghua, Fudan, or Beijing, Dashui. It's really, really tough, challenging. So I think in all those countries, but the irony is they still have very large classes, like 35, 40 students. They're very respectful of the teacher, but I like to point out that it's ingrained in the culture, even as language. The word sensei or sansenim in Korean can be defined as somebody who is older than you. Not that they're smarter, not that they know anything. Somebody who is older than you is smarter, is wiser. And that's something that is ingrained in the Confucian system. And when I was a senior consultant at Google, when I joined, Eric Schmidt was my age, who was CEO. 6 months later, Larry Page is 35 years old. So he kind of regressed, and Google is doing very well. So I think in the U.S., there are so many opportunities for creation, like you say, value creation, knowledge creation. Something that was not even part of search is quite new when you think about it. It's been around only since the late 90s. And it's Google is one of the largest companies in the U.S. now. And of course, it was founded by just two young PhD students, and one was an immigrant from Russia.
It seems that Asian parents who have the means, the financial means, really like to send their kids abroad to study because they realize that the learning environment in non-Asian universities is probably more conducive to the creation of creative thought. And it still seems that although there's some very good universities in Asia, Tokyo University, the most preeminent one, that they're still having trouble making that transition. And essentially because of that, the economies of these places are somewhat held back. They have certain limitations. I mean, it seems that Asian culture is very good for creating a manufacturing society. The curriculum's lots of emphasis on science, lots of emphasis on mathematics. The culture induces very high levels of obedience. That's exactly what you need for a manufacturing society. That manufacturing is becoming, that's not where the money of the future is. In this way, the U.S. has an advantage.
That's, I think, the research universities, top research universities in the United States are the envy of the world. And I think for much of the research, leading research that takes place in East Asian countries, even in Japan or South Korea or Taiwan takes place in private labs.
That's a good point. That's a very good
and
point.
there's a profound difference. And just in our youth, Bell Labs was the leading lab in electronics and telecoms in the world. Where is it now? It's gone. But there's a lot of great work in labs still in Japan, and Samsung or Panasonic, NEC, Fujitsu, and Canon, for example. Their products are unbelievable. And again, that's the great difference, I think, between the U.S. and East Asian, some of the East Asian countries. So, some people, when they have a doctorate in East Asia, the first question people ask, where did you do your dissertation? And some did it in their companies, in their labs, not at a university. And those are seen sometimes as better because the facilities are better. Electronics and the IT and everything is so much better at some of these private labs that their PhD has a little more meaning and value.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, I think that's a good point. A lot of Asian universities aren't really attuned to the marketplace.
That's right. In fact, if you go to some of the even leading Japanese universities, even Tokyo University or Kyoto or some of the others, you see some dilapidated labs, not first rate at all. So that's, and again, the money is at the private labs, and many people. That's why there aren't that many PhDs, or they take their PhD later, doing the research at their private sector lab later on. And whereas in the U.S., you have a lot of people in graduate school thinking about a product.
Right.
Thinking
That's
about getting together with friends, thinking about getting some venture capital, thinking about having a hit product.
Right.
You see, and of course there may be people from India, from China, from Europe, and from all over the world. That intellectual ferment, or that exciting kinds of conversation doesn't exist in many universities in Korea or Japan or Taiwan.
Right. That's a good point. You were mentioning Japan before, Taiwan, and how it benefited from the Japanese education system. I think it's interesting to point out, too, that according to many, and I think it's probably true, that during the period that Taiwan was a Japanese colony, it had the second highest standard of living in Asia next to Japan itself. So there was a very positive aspects of Japanese colonialism, unlike the Korean experience. Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think a lot of people don't quite realize that.
It is a very sensitive point because from 1895 to 1945, that period when Taiwan was under Japanese colonial rule, they were citizens of the empire. And that some of the elite during the 20s and 30s and so forth went to Keio, Waseda, or University of Tokyo to be educated. Right. And they came back, and there were some Japanese immigrants or administrators in Taiwan, Taipei and so forth. But the bulk of the people who work in administration and engineering and so forth, infrastructure in Taiwan, were local Taiwanese. And then comes 1949, when Chiang Kai-shek comes from the mainland, comes to Taiwan. He brought an influx of mainland people, who some of them, according to some Taiwanese, never had seen a elevator before. And there were department stores. We were the Mitsukoshis and all the top departments in Taipei. They were on the same par as Tokyo.
All right. We're going to take another break here. You're watching Asia in Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Our guest today is Ray Tsuchiyama, who has a vast experience of dealing with technological affairs in Asia. He's had a lot of really interesting positions with Google, with AOL, and the list goes on. He's also published a lot in various publications, including Business Week and New York Times. We're going to be right back, and don't go away.
Aloha, my name is Paul Jackson, better known as PJ, and my local interest is in sports. I have my own sports radio show at KWAI AM 1080 that you can stream live. I also have my own website, pjsportsradio.com, We have live guests in studio, and we talk about discussions and topics that everyone wants to know locally here on the islands. We cover everything from surfing to basketball to whatever's going on locally, sports-wise. We try to do our best and cover the topics in depth as much as we can. Once again, thank you for joining PJ here on Hawaii Sports Update. Mahalo.
Aloha, I'm Hunter Hevlin, host of Sustainable Hawaii here at ThinkTech Hawaii. You can tune in every week on Thursday at 2 p.m. to see interviews with sustainability professionals from around the state and even further abroad, learning about activities with water management, food security, waste management, and a whole host of other fascinating opportunities to get engaged with making a greener island. So if you're interested in making the transition from consuming individuals to communities of producers, check us out every Thursday.
Welcome back to Asia in Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. We've been talking to Ray Tsuchiyama today, having a really interesting discussion about Taiwan, its economics. The title of our show is Taiwan, Still an Economic Tiger? And we've really been looking at the development of Taiwan's economy and talking about its pluses and also some of its setbacks and some of the challenges that it faces. An area which we touched upon earlier in the show, but I'd like to get back to now in our closing minutes here, is venture capitalism. Why hasn't venture capitalism worked so well in Asia? Why isn't it a fixture of Asian economic development?
Well, there's several reasons. There's a lot of money, first of all.
Sure, the money's there.
I mean, you go to the Tokyo, Seoul, or Taipei, there's a huge construction and money and so forth. I think it's dependent on several things that Silicon Valley has and other places don't. Number one, you must have people who can identify a product having some kind of value in the future. And the eye says, oh, that would be a hit product. That's number one. The ability to draw a team, a CEO, a COO, CTO, a CFO together to start up a company. That's very, very critical to all this. Third is the risk factor, that it's okay to take risks and it's okay to fail.
That's that cultural thing. It deals with the development of new products and the fact that before you develop a new product, you might fail several times, and which holds these countries back from developing these new value-added, high value-added products. And it's the thing with venture capitalism, too. Venture capital is all about taking risks. There's lots of failure involved.
Well, if you're in the manufacturing world, like you mentioned, you don't want to junk your factory. Right? You made an investment.
Okay,
so,
okay, that makes sense.
That's where we're coming from.
That makes sense.
So a lot of people, of course, managers don't want to go to the next paradigm when they have already made a huge investment in the old paradigm, where, be it all kinds of electronics or whatever. And the risk factor is exactly what you said, that in Silicon Valley, many places, that they would rather hire a person or listen to a person who has failed twice or three times. Well, that person must have learned something during those failures and will make him a success next time. That's how they think.
Right.
Whereas in East Asia, if you fail once, that's the end. You're a pariah. That's the end.
It seems to me there's a very American thing here. The American thing is, well, if you try and you fail, that's okay, because that's better than not trying at all. And if you fail, you just pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and go back at it. And Asia doesn't work that way.
Well, Winston Churchill had a great line about Americans, because his mother was an American. He said, Americans will do the right thing after trying everything else. But that's a very interesting idea, because if you see people around you in an organization and so forth, it's striking to me in America how much people want to wing it.
In America?
Yes.
Wing it.
Yeah,
Okay.
They just want to do things and try it out. And if it succeeds, it's, wow, I did it, without doing all the heavy lifting to get to somewhere. You see the planning and so forth. In Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, there's an enormous amount of planning before you do anything. And then everybody does the same thing, and that's why they're so good at manufacturing.
You know, I think there's a comparison that can be drawn here with musicians. Now, Asian musicians from these countries we've been talking about, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, They're very good at technique, violin technique or whatever the instrument is. But when it comes to improvisation, that's where they fall down. American musicians are maybe not that great with their technique, but they're good at improvisation. It's the same idea, I think.
Oh, jazz is very American.
Yeah.
Jazz is not from Europe, it's from New Orleans and Kansas City.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
That's a great point. Wow. You really gave us some things to think about here. Hey, let's move on. We got about 4 or 5 minutes left here. Let's talk about India. I think a lot of policy folks in Washington are pinning great hopes on India, hoping that it'll balance China. Well, I see a lot of Northeast Asian countries, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, investing a lot of money in India. How do you see India?
Well, I've been going to India many times from the 90s, and even back then, it was racked by government regulation. That is stifling. What's called a license Raj. In order to do anything, you have to get a license, and then they just don't do it, and that's where corruption starts when payments and so forth. So it's hard. It was hard to do anything in India. Whereas, and also, this is better or worse, but I would say India is a democracy.
Right.
They do vote for their prime minister. In China, you can't even vote for the mayor. You cannot start a political party in People's Republic. But if you wanted a new factory or new city, they just go ahead and do it, and then remove hundreds of thousands of people and relocate them like a blink of an eye. India, they cannot do that because people are resistant and they listen to the people. So that is a great difference. But at the same time, China has moved forward economically and raised the standard of living dramatically. Whereas you can go back to the early 60s, and if you saw the world from far up, you would have said, oh, India, from the war, they had great English-speaking capabilities, great universities, infrastructure that the British left over. This would be a powerhouse economically. They just couldn't get their act together.
Yeah. The education system is, well, the Indian Institute of Technology, that's considered very first class, and they have branches all over India. But some of the other universities in India, I kind of wonder about. And it seems infrastructure is a huge problem in India.
Infrastructure, I think, is a tremendous issue because in China, if you had a consumer product like a toy, you could put up a factory with electricity. You could get the toy through a truck to an airport. The airport works. You could get the toy to the United States and sell it. None of that is there in India. You cannot get electricity. The roads are terrible. The airports are all infrastructure. So you're correct. The infrastructure is not there. That's why the software development and the call centers were such a big thing. You see, software can be over the line and sent. Not a thing. Not a manufacturing thing.
Oh, great. Well, we've come to the end of our time again, and we've had a really interesting discussion about Taiwan and went a little bit further, talked about India, and hit upon some really important cultural points, I think, here today, and which influence economic development and venture capitalism. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. You gave us a lot to think about. It's always good to talk to you, and thanks for spending your time with us on Asian Review.
Thank you very much, and all I can say is that everything I learned about the world comes from growing up in Kalihi, Palama.
Thank you very much for watching. Next week, my guest is Ralph Kosa, president of Pacific Forum CSIS. He's always a very insightful commentator and observer of international affairs in Asia, and I'm sure that you'll want to join us. We'll see you then.